We are often told a comfortable story about how the world became rich. Open any economics textbook, flip to the chapter on development, and you'll find a neat, clean answer. A country opens its borders, plays by the rules, embraces the free market, and wealth follows. It's a story of progress, of competition, of fair play. But for the nations of the developing world, the story looks nothing like that. Because while Western powers preached the virtues of free trade to the rest of the world, they were busy practicing the exact opposite at home. They didn't get rich by playing fair. They got rich by cheating, by the very standards they now enforce on everyone else. This is the dark history of the economic ladder, and the brutal reality of what happens when a nation tries to climb it after it has already been kicked away. If you open a modern textbook, you will find the United States and Great Britain described as the historic champions of free trade, the founding fathers of the open market, the nations that proved, beyond doubt, that economic freedom creates prosperity. But if you go back, if you actually look at the 1800s, the era when these giants were growing, you find a reality that looks nothing like the myth. In December of 1791, Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and the man who would become the architect of the American economy, presented a document to Congress. He called it the Report on the Subject of Manufactures. And in it, he laid out a terrifying truth. If America played by the free trade rules, if it simply opened its borders and let the market decide, it would remain a permanent agricultural servant to the British Empire, a nation of farmers, forever buying clothes and tools and machinery from its colonial master, and forever paying for the privilege. So Hamilton didn't choose freedom. He chose protection. He recommended high tariffs on foreign manufactured goods to kill off British competition before it could kill American industry. He called for government subsidies to build new industries from scratch. He argued that a young nation could not survive in a world dominated by established powers without first shielding itself from them. And for over a century, that is exactly what America did. The United States was, by many measures, the most aggressively protected economy on Earth throughout the 1800s. Tariffs on manufactured imports routinely ran between 40% and 50%. Government money poured into infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads, that private markets alone would never have built. Industries were nursed, protected, and subsidized until they were strong enough to compete. This was not a free market. It was a managed market, engineered by the state for the benefit of the nation. And Britain did the same before them. Before Britain preached free trade to the world in the mid-1800s, it had spent nearly 2 centuries using the most aggressive protectionist policies imaginable, banning the import of Indian textiles to protect its own wool industry, imposing the Navigation Acts to crush colonial competition, and using state power at every turn to ensure British manufacturers dominated global markets. It was only once Britain had become the undisputed workshop of the world, only once it no longer needed protection, that it became the loudest voice for free trade. The ladder was built, and then the sermon began. By the mid-20th century, the age of empires was supposed to be over. In West Africa, Ghana was celebrating. In 1957, it became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from colonial rule. Its new president, Kwame Nkrumah, stood before the world with a nation that, by many measures, looked extraordinarily promising. Ghana was the world's leading producer of cocoa. It held 10% of the world's gold. It had a functioning infrastructure, a growing middle class, and foreign reserves of over $530 million, 7 times its long-term debt. Half a world away, South Korea was a different kind of story. The Korean War had ended in 1953, leaving the peninsula devastated. By the late 1950s, South Korea was one of the poorest countries on Earth, almost entirely dependent on U.S. foreign aid just to function. Its infrastructure was shattered, its institutions were fragile, its economy barely existed. And yet, by 1957, Ghana and South Korea had roughly similar income levels per person. Two nations starting from roughly the same place. But the rules were about to be applied with a brutal and historic inconsistency. Because of the Cold War, because America desperately needed South Korea to succeed as a bulwark against communist North Korea, South Korea was quietly handed something that the rest of the developing world would be denied. It was handed the latter. Under President Park Chung-hee through the 1960s and 70s, South Korea was permitted, even encouraged, to use the exact same tools that Hamilton had used a century and a half earlier. The government picked industries to dominate. It directed capital toward them. It protected the domestic market from foreign competition. Foreign car brands were effectively banned. Korean banks were controlled by the state and told where to lend. The government identified companies, Samsung, Hyundai, POSCO, and poured resources into making them global giants. South Korea didn't play by free market rules, it played by Hamilton's rules. And it worked. Between 1960 and 1990, South Korea's GDP per capita grew by more than 900%. The country transformed from a war-ruined aid recipient into the 13th largest economy in the world. But for Ghana, and for most of Africa, the story was completely different. And the reasons why are far darker than most people are willing to say out loud. The 1800s was the era of the industrial master. The 1980s became the era of the debt collector. When the global economy shook in the late 1970s, hit by oil shocks, stagflation, and a global recession, African nations found themselves buried under debts they could no longer service. Commodity prices had collapsed. Dollar-denominated loans had become impossible to repay. Country after country was on the edge of bankruptcy. And that is when the advice turned into a weapon. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank arrived, not as partners in development, but as the only lenders left. And they came with conditions. A program called structural adjustment. Structural adjustment was, in theory, a medicine. In practice, for many nations, it was closer to a controlled demolition. The terms were non-negotiable. If you wanted the loan, if you wanted to avoid defaulting and being cut off from global finance entirely, you had to accept the package. And the package looked something like this. Cut government spending, immediately. No more subsidies to local industry, no more support for farmers. Privatize state-owned enterprises. Devalue your currency. Remove tariffs. Open your markets to foreign competition. In other words, do the exact opposite of what every currently rich nation did when it was at your stage of development. Do the opposite of what Hamilton did. Do the opposite of what Britain did. Do the opposite of what South Korea was doing at that very moment. Open your gates and hope for the best. For Ghana, the results were devastating. Ghana's textile industry at its peak employed more than 25,000 people. There were 16 major manufacturers and 138 medium and large-scale garment companies operating across the country. When structural adjustment policies forced open Ghana's markets in the 1980s and 1990s, cheap foreign textiles, primarily from Asia, flooded in. Local factories, suddenly stripped of the protection that had allowed them to survive, could not compete. By 2002, only 4 major textile companies remained. The country had lost roughly 4/5 of its textile and clothing jobs in a single generation. Imagine a child being forced into a boxing ring with a heavyweight world champion. No preparation, no training, no coach, just the instruction. Compete. That wasn't a market, it was a massacre. And the farmers? Across much of Africa, local agriculture had depended on government support to stay viable. Structural adjustment removed all of it. At the same moment, the United States and European nations maintained, and in some cases expanded, their own enormous agricultural subsidies. American subsidized rice flooded markets across the Caribbean and West Africa. Farmers who had grown rice for generations could not sell their own crop at a price that covered their costs, because imported rice, grown by heavily subsidized American farmers, was being sold cheaper than it cost to produce locally. The rules said, "No subsidies for you," but the rules said nothing about us. The latter wasn't just kicked away, it was used to beat the competition down. Here's the question that gets lost in every conversation about African poverty, about development, about why some nations are rich and others are not. The question is not, why did these countries fail to develop? The question is, were they ever actually allowed to? Because when you look at the history, when you trace the line from Hamilton's protectionism to Britain's navigation acts, a pattern emerges that is difficult to dismiss. Every nation that successfully industrialized in the past 250 years, Britain, the United States, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, did so behind walls of protection. Every single one used tariffs, subsidies, and managed trade to build its industries before exposing them to global competition. And then, once they were powerful, the sermon began. Free trade, open markets, level playing fields. The economist Ha-Joon Chang called this kicking away the ladder, the act of pulling up the very policy tools that allowed rich nations to develop and then telling developing nations those tools are forbidden. Now, none of this is to say that governance didn't matter. It did. Corruption destroyed resources, political instability made planning impossible. There are no simple heroes and villains in this story. But here is what is also true. The narrative that blames African poverty entirely on African failure, on corruption, on culture, while ignoring the architecture of the global system those countries were forced to operate within, is not just incomplete, it is dishonest. We look at the world today and see a gap that seems almost natural. The gleaming skylines of Seoul, the markets of Accra, the factories of Shenzhen, the fields of the Sahel. But the gap is not inevitable. Seoul and Accra started from roughly the same place. South Korea was allowed to climb the ladder. Ghana was forced to fight without it. The distance between Seoul's skyscrapers and Accra's markets is not a distance of talent or effort or ambition. It is the distance between a country that was permitted to protect its young industries and a continent that was forced to expose its young industries to the full force of global competition before they had any chance of surviving it. The wealth of one part of the world and the poverty of another are not disconnected. They are, in many ways, two sides of the same ledger. In June of 1944, the state of South Carolina executed a 14-year-old boy named George Stinney Jr. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in a single day. He was so small he had to sit on a Bible in the electric chair. The trial lasted a few hours. The all-white jury deliberated for 10 minutes. 70 years later, in December 2014, the South Carolina judge vacated the conviction. She found that the process itself was so corrupted it could not be allowed to stand. The procedure, it turned out, was the crime. One day, perhaps not soon, but one day, history may look back at the economic advice of the late 20th century with the same cold clarity. Not as a story of misguided help, but as a story of a system that was designed to look like assistance while functioning as control. A story of a ladder that was real, that worked, and that was quietly removed before most of the world ever had a chance to climb it. Injustice rarely arrives as chaos. It arrives dressed as procedure. It arrives as conditions on a loan, as advice from an expert, as a level playing field that was never actually level. It arrives as a free market that was never actually free. If this is the kind of history you want to understand, the real mechanics of how the world actually works, not the polished version, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this story left to tell.